Today I'm filming a video with a supercharged, mid-engine, all-wheel drive, ultra-rare 1990s car. It's this, a 1997 Toyota Previa, and it's the weirdest minivan ever. Now, I recently brought you videos with the Mercedes-Benz Metris, which was a terrible minivan, and the Honda Odyssey Elite, which was a fantastic minivan. This is a weird minivan, and yes, it is supercharged, all-wheel drive, and mid-engine. It just probably isn't the supercharged, all-wheel drive, mid-engine car you were expecting. So here's the deal. If you've spent even an hour in North America, you know the Toyota Sienna, which has been Toyota's minivan for the last 20 years. Before the Sienna, if you wanted a Toyota minivan, you got this, the Toyota Previa, which was shaped like an egg. The Previa was sold in the US from 1991 to 1997, and there were two versions. There was a base model, which was rear-wheel drive, and it was offered with a manual transmission, which means this was, in the base form, a manual transmission, rear-wheel drive, mid-engine minivan with all of 138 horsepower. You could also opt for all-wheel drive like this one, and for a supercharger like this one has. It produced a scorching 161 horsepower. Unfortunately, the supercharged version wasn't offered with a manual transmission. It was automatic only, to the great sadness of car enthusiasts. About 4 car enthusiasts. So anyway, this is the best of the breed, a Toyota Previa with the supercharged engine with all-wheel drive from the final model year with less than 100,000 miles. It's one of the few preserved Previas. So today, I'm going to show you around the weirdest minivan. I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and cool features, and I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Previa, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer. Now I'm going to start on the outside, and specifically I'm going to start with the sliding door. I say sliding door because there's only one. This vehicle has 3 doors, 2 in the front and 1 sliding door only on the passenger side. There's no rear door on the driver's side. Now, incredibly, this was actually common in minivans from this era. The thinking was, if you pulled up to the curb, you didn't want your kids inside to get out on the traffic side. You wanted them to get out on the curb side where it was safe. I guess kids of SUV owners were smart enough to look for traffic, but they figured minivan kids were too dumb. Anyway, the first minivan to actually have dual sliding doors was the 1996 Dodge Grand Caravan. Before that, all minivans had 2 doors in front and only 1 sliding door on the passenger side. The Previa is no exception. Next up, I want to move on to the front window shape. Now, you could probably tell this van has some weird windows, and we'll get to all of them in a minute. Maybe the weirdest is this front window that rolls down. Take a look at the shape of this thing. It's like this weird polygon. You will never see another car window shaped like this. Also weird is this window in the A-pillar. It's a giant triangle owing to the fact that this windshield has a crazy steep rake, and they couldn't make the door stick all the way out this far, so they had to stick this giant fixed triangle window in here in the corner. Something else you'll probably never see on another car again, certainly not a modern one. Next up, we move on to the wheels, and specifically the lug nuts. Now, this particular Previa has 15-inch alloys, pretty good, and in order to preserve the clean, beautiful look of the Previa, they've covered up the lug nuts with this little cap. There are a lot of really expensive performance and luxury cars that don't bother to cover up the lug nuts, but Toyota did, because the Previa was something special. Now, next up, we move on to the fuel door. There's something particularly interesting about this fuel door. You open it with a little lever under the driver's seat, just like a lot of Toyota models from the time, and it pops open. One thing I do like, though, is the fuel cap. Printed on the fuel cap are the words, "When installing, turn till you hear clicks." Not turn until you hear clicks, but turn till you hear clicks. That's a nice little folksy statement from Toyota. Oh, we're going to say till instead of until. You see, we're just like the American vans. We use all the English colloquialisms too. See? Next up, moving on to the rear of the Previa, a couple of interesting things back here. One is, if you look below the bumper, you'll see a little tow hitch area. This thing is rated to tow 3,500 pounds. That's pretty impressive for a minivan, but it's especially impressive for a vehicle with 161 horsepower. I can only imagine what towing 3,500 pounds would have been like in the base model with 138 horsepower. I suspect you'd want to try to avoid hills. Another thing I like back here on the tailgate is the rear washer spray jet. It just sort of sticks up out there. They haven't made any attempt to conceal it underneath a spoiler or a wing or sort of hide it into the glass. It's just there. It's functional. Deal with it. And next up we move on to the front washer fluid and the windshield wipers. The windshield wipers sort of come out from the middle, which is useful on a windshield that's as steeply raked as this one. It means that they cover more ground. Also, the other cool thing about the wipers, the windshield washer fluid spray is wired inside the wipers, so when you turn them on, it sort of sprays in the path of the wiper and not just randomly on the windshield like in a lot of cars. The funny thing about this, of course, is that in back that spray nozzle just sort of unceremoniously sticks out, whereas in the front, they've gone to great measures to conceal the nozzles. It's odd, but then again, so is this car. Next up, we move under the hood. Now, a few times I've called this a mid-engine vehicle, but you can clearly see there's a hood in the front. It opens like a normal hood, and the engine's under here. Well, not quite. There is a hood in front. It does open like a normal hood, but take a look under here. There's the battery, there's some air intake, there's some reservoirs. The engine, however, is missing. That's because the engine is right here in this giant hump in the floor between the driver and passenger seats. That's where you'll find this thing's supercharged 4-cylinder. All 161 horses live right here. Now, when I said this was a mid-engine vehicle, obviously it's not a rear mid-engine vehicle like an MR2 or a Ferrari, but the engine is completely in the middle between the axles. This isn't some technicality. The engine doesn't even start until beyond the wheels. Now, that leads to some interesting complications. The biggest of which is, in order to check the oil in your Previa, you have to get under the driver's seat. You push this little yellow tab under the driver's seat. The driver's seat moves backwards. It sort of releases, and then you can get under there and get to the engine. You move aside the carpeting that's there. You twist this little lock screw cap, and then, well, there's your engine. It's been underneath where you're sitting this entire time. It's very bizarre. And if you go under there, you will find a dipstick so you can check your oil level, and also you can add oil underneath the driver's seat in the interior of this car. Now, if you look under the driver's seat, you'll find a warning label that refers to this as the engine access hole. I guess that's what Toyota calls it, but I view it a little differently. You see, in this car, the hood up front doesn't really lead to the engine. Instead, my feeling is if you have a Previa, your hood is not up front. Instead, it's a piece of carpeting under the driver's seat. And the weirdness with the seats is not done yet. Now I'm here in the second row, and it looks like a fairly normal second row seat in a minivan. Nice captain's chairs, and they slide forward and backward, which is nice and helpful, but they also do something else you might find interesting. They turn. If you push this little button below the seats, they turn. And then you can drive around in your Previa and face whoever's sitting in the third row. You can't do that in your Honda Odyssey. Look at this, I can turn all the way around. And the seat on the other side does it too. So basically you could be driven around by your parents or whoever in the front, and you could all be facing each other back here, playing card games or having some sort of conference. I don't really know. That's a cool feature, but I'm not done yet. Check this out. If you're sitting here in the normal position, the Previa has a fairly typical 3-point belt that comes over your shoulder. That's obvious and normal. However, what would happen then if you rotate the seat around? Suddenly you're not belted in? That doesn't seem like it would be in compliance with any regulations. Check this out. Toyota has included a separate lap belt that belts into the same buckle, and so when you turn around, you can still be belted in even though you're not covered by the regular 3-point seatbelt that exists for people who are sitting in the normal configuration. There are redundant seatbelts, or rather seatbelts for two different purposes, which means that turning around and facing the back in this car can still be a perfectly safe endeavor. That said, you weren't really supposed to sit on the seats unless they were locked either facing forward or facing all the way backwards, and Toyota made sure that you knew this by sticking a warning label at the bottom of the backrest on the front seats that says on it, and I'm quoting here, "To prevent personal injury before driving, push the seat back and forth to be sure the seat is securely locked in position." In other words, before driving, Toyota wanted to make sure you did this a couple times and jiggled it to make sure that it was locked in position to prevent personal injury. And you didn't think the weirdness with the seats was done yet, did you? Of course not. Now we're in the third row, and as you can see, the third row seats are, well, they're sort of stuck up here on the sides of the van. That's because this third row lived in a time before stow and go seats. Now it's common, you just fold the third row into the floor and you move on with your way. But at the time, no one was doing that, and so instead what some car companies did was they stuck the third row up against the windows. Now that alone is a little bit of a quirk, but installing the seats is another one. The first step was you had to unhook the little strap from the rear grab handle, and that would lower the seats. Then you removed the rear headrest from its storage place, which is sort of like on the side of the seat when it's not in use. Then there was this little black thing you folded down to latch the seat into the floor. Then there was a little latch on the seat itself you pulled in order to put the backrest up. Then you installed the headrest, and the third row seat was ready to go. And of course, when you didn't want it, you just stuck it right back into place, and then it was out of your way, and you could use this as a cargo area. It was pretty straightforward, although I have to say that pulling one little strap in the Honda Odyssey and folding the seats into the floor is quite a bit easier. But the interior of the Previa isn't only weird because of its seats. There are also a couple of other interesting quirks in here. I'm going to start with one of them you may have already seen, and that would be the parking brake, which is mounted to the left of the driver's seat. It's not a foot-mounted brake, and they couldn't put it in the middle because that's where the engine is. So it's to the left of the driver's seat in a place you will never see it on any other minivan. Next up, we move on to the gauge cluster. Now, the gauge cluster is fairly normal Toyota 90s gauge cluster, although it does have one little interesting component to it. The warning lights aren't just little pictures that light up like in every other car, like an engine for a check engine light. Instead, the picture lights up, but also there's a little light to the left of the picture that lights up in addition, and they're all sort of arranged in two neat columns instead of sort of all over the gauge cluster like basically every other car. That was Toyota practicality. Next up, we move on to the sun visor, which is a fairly standard sun visor, and it has a sun visor mirror, like basically every car. The weird thing about this one is that the sun visor mirror cover doesn't open up like in every other car. Instead, it opens down, which means it actually blocks your visibility. In fact, it opens down below where the sun visor opens by like 3 inches. So if you want to look at yourself with your sun visor open in the Previa, you better do it while you're at a stoplight, or else you won't really be able to see anything. And next up, we gotta talk windshield because it's insane. I already showed you the steep rake on the outside and the wipers, but look at it from the inside. It is so bizarre. There's like 4 feet of car that's in front of you when you're driving along that's all contained within the interior. I've never really seen anything like this before. It is crazy. And it's almost unique to this car. There aren't many vehicles that have that windshield design, although it's worth noting in the 90s, General Motors sold the Chevy Lumina APV and the Oldsmobile Silhouette, and they had a similar front-end design. So it wasn't totally out of the realm in the minivan world at the time. What was a little crazy in the minivan world, even back then, is the swoopy dashboard design of this vehicle. It is bizarre. The dashboard basically makes a W shape if you look at it from above, or an M depending on your orientation. It sort of goes in and out and in and out. I don't know if it's supposed to like look like a spaceship or what's going on, but it's weird. And speaking of weird, because of that swoopy dashboard design, there's another interesting little item in this car, and that would be the air vents. The air vents' natural position is slanted all the way to the side because that's the only way they can blow air on the cabin. If you place the air vents so they're going directly forward like you would in every other car, they would blow sort of like in the middle of the dashboard. You actually have to have the air vents all the way tilted to the side in order to get any air onto you when you're driving the car or sitting in the passenger seat. And while the climate control vents in front are kind of unusual, the ones in the rear are even stranger. The craziest one is the one that gives heat and air to the feet of the rear seat passengers. Now, usually this comes through a center console, but this car doesn't have that because remember, the engine is in the middle of the front seat. So instead, those air ducts go all the way through the dashboard, through the entire front door, and then there's a vent at the very back of the front door that spits out air onto rear passengers' feet. I've never seen that before. But just as strange as that is, maybe the vent mounted on the roof is even a little bit stranger. It seems pretty normal to have air conditioning for the rear passengers, but this thing just looks like overkill. It almost looks like it should start talking at any moment or have some sort of neon lights inside of it. It's massive. And I also like the fact that there are 2 vents, and in the middle where there would be blank space, Toyota decided to stick the Toyota logo on it. Why not? Anyway, a couple of other interesting rear quirks beyond the climate control vents. One of them is that the rear seats have dual armrests. These rear captain's chairs, each rear seat has 2 armrests. The cool thing about that is the front seats only have 1 armrest each. So the rear seat passengers are really awash in luxury back here in their movable seats as they sit using both armrests while they're driven down the road. It's also worth noting that there is a stunning number of cup holders inside the Previa, which actually surprised me. Older minivans didn't usually have all the same conveniences that modern ones do. And admittedly, this one doesn't have like the 29 cup holders in the Odyssey Elite or whatever it was, but it does have quite a few. There are 2 up front hidden inside the swoopy dash. There are 4 for the middle seat passengers. There's 2 on the left side of this seat. You open it up and then you can unfold the cup holders. There's 2 more on the driver's side of the van where that door should be but isn't. So that's 4 total here. And then there's 2 more cup holders for the third row, 1 on each side, which is really impressive. 8 total cup holders in a vehicle from 1997. I mean, back then, people just weren't consuming as many drinks, so that's good. And finally, we turn our attention back to the front and specifically to the glove box, which is where I found the original 1997 Toyota Previa owner's manual, which is pretty cool. Now, I always like to find a couple of Easter eggs inside the owner's manual, and in this case, I found literal Easter eggs. Turn to page 168, and it shows the Previa being towed, and you can see that even Toyota realized it looked like an egg. Look at that depiction of the Previa. It's so accurate. And then if you turn to page 31, you can see the egg-shaped minivan carrying passengers. Also, an accurate depiction of what the Previa looks like. Another interesting thing inside the original Toyota Previa owner's manual pouch is this Toyota Previa mini manual. It's sort of like a quick reference guide for stuff you use commonly, and look at the outside of this thing. If you're at all a Toyota fan or a 90s car fan, you'll recognize those designs. Those were all the Toyota products at the time, sort of like a blast from the past. The mini manual itself isn't particularly interesting. It just tells you how to use the air conditioning and all that, but the cover of the mini manual reminds me that I should really go on Auto Trader and start looking for those old 90s 4Runners. So those are all the quirks and features of the 1997 Toyota Previa LESC All-Track. Well, not quite all the quirks, because now I'm going to drive around in the egg-shaped minivan. All right, driving the Previa. That's right. Now I'm living in the real world or something. I don't know what that means. Kind of thing people would say in 1997 now. It's a van. The driving position is absurd. I mean, I can't even come close to reaching the base of the windshield. Even if I lean all the way forward. Try that in your car. You'll reach. This one is in nice shape. It really is. This one is a clean one of these. The driving position is actually quite tall. I think because you're sitting here on the engine, it really takes you even taller than like almost many modern crossovers. Now, I'm obviously not exactly driving this thing on back roads, but I don't think that's really necessary for the Previa. Handling, I'm not gonna go and pretend that I'm some great authority in knowing based on driving it around New York City for an hour, but I'm also not going to pretend like it would be a lot tighter if I took it out in the country. It's not as vague. The steering is not as vague as I was expecting, but it's, it feels loose. And I mean, it's a van. What do you want? If you're even watching this part, I suspect you're into the Previa, because most people are like, well, that's weird, but I don't really care how it drives. Everything in this car feels so much like a 90s Toyota. My dad had a 98 Camry when I was growing up. And like everything's the same. The steering wheel's the same, the turn signal stock, even the clicking noise when the turn signal's on. This is your typical 90s Toyota, except with some weirdnesses to it. It's hilarious to me how loud the motor is for the wiper. Admittedly, I don't have the music on the radio, but when the wipers, I got them on intermittent, and when it's ready and it does its thing, it's like, and then it's quiet again. I really like the driving position, actually. I made fun of it earlier because you're so far from the windshield, but that's actually not something you even really think about all that much when you're driving. It doesn't really affect you that much. What it reminds me of is a Honda Fit. It has that sort of same feel. The Fit has a very small hood too, and sort of that same egg shape in front. But the interesting thing about it is that you're so high up. I mean, I'm behind a Highlander here, and I feel like we're about on the same level There's Nissan Armada to the left, which is a big SUV, and that's taller. But I feel like I'm kind of holding my own in this world of SUVs. You know, it's a rainy day, trafficking New York. I mean, this is actually not the worst place to be. You know, I have windows everywhere. This car sort of comes before, you know, airbags became everywhere, and so pillars kind of got bigger to accommodate them. But it also comes before this craze of rising belt lines. You know, the Odyssey has that line that rises and then kind of kinks. This thing just is like I'm sitting in like a fish tank, and I can just see everywhere and everything. And actually, the seats mounted back there in the third row, which I said would hamper visibility, it's not really that much of an issue. The mirrors are large, there's windows everywhere. I don't think that I would really cause a problem unless I was doing sort of a severe over-the-shoulder check. Maybe if there was a car in that specific spot, I might miss it. I will say one thing about this car. You know, it's got character. And that alone makes it kind of cool and kind of interesting. In a world where cars are sort of becoming more and more look-alike and all that, it's cool. And you might think it's crazy that I wanted to do a 90s minivan video after some of the exotic cars I've done and all that. But, you know, this car is special too. And there are fewer and fewer of them every day. And I kind of wanted to see what it was like. And so that's the 1997 Toyota Previa. This car doesn't have any major significance to the automotive world. It wasn't really all that popular back in the 90s. It was underpowered even with the supercharger. And back then, the Dodge Caravan was probably a better vehicle. It had dual sliding doors. It's hard to believe the Caravan could have been better, but it probably was. But the Dodge Caravan isn't interesting. This thing is weird on the outside, on the inside, under the hood, everywhere. It's just so unique, and it's such a major departure from the conservative, pragmatic Toyota we know today. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Previa is odd, but it's not offensively ugly, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration is weak even with the big ol' supercharger, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is fine for a van of this age, nothing special, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Cool factor is debatable, but in my opinion, these are becoming cooler with car geeks who find them funky and bizarre, and I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. Finally, there's importance, which I think we all agree is low. This is an interesting car, but not a particularly special one, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Added up, and the total weekend score is 16 out of 50, meaning it beats the Pontiac Aztek and the Honda Odyssey. Take that. As for the daily categories, starting with features, the Previa doesn't have much, but it's got everything you'd expect for a 1990s van, plus a few cool extras, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is okay, the interior is mediocre of course, but fitting for a vehicle at this price point. I've heard good things about reliability, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is obvious, the giant egg has tons of room and huge swivel seats, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, there's value, and here's the thing, you can buy a great Previa for $5,000 and have one of the coolest, most distinctive surf vans or bike vans or work vans or even family haulers, and when you're done you can sell it for like $4,000. It easily earns a 7 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to 32 out of 50, which is pretty impressive. But then again, this is a cheap, practical people mover. Add it all up and the Doug score is 48 out of 100, which is, well, reasonable. Not earth-shattering, but of course this is a 20-year-old Toyota minivan.